Hello and welcome back to Cooking the Books with me, Gilly Smith, the podcast which takes us through 4 food moments from the books of our favourite food writers. It's about life through the prism of food. And this week we're going back to London, 2002, a time before pomegranate molasses, when Nigella and Jamie were first on the telly and Ottolenghi had yet to chuck his flavour bombs into the salad bowl of British cuisine, to the publication of the very first Diana Henry book, Crazy Water, Pickled Lemons.
I didn't stop to think, funny enough, it might be different now, that I shouldn't do this because this wasn't my food. It was basically the food of my imagination and the food I had longed for as I was growing up.
Now, Diana and I have met before. Click on the link in the show notes to our chats about how to eat a peach and roast figs, sugar, snow. But this time, we're going back to a time when we were both TV producers, intoxicated by the smells and eating habits of an increasingly diverse and exotic capital. I asked her to take me back to a time just before she began to write and explain what was happening inside her head.
This is really about coming to London, full stop. I mean, I came from Oxford, where I'd been, and the journey, we came in a white van down from Oxford to this tiny basement flat in Islington. And I mean, I'd been in Oxford, so I'd left Northern Ireland. But Oxford was very quiet in those days, not incredibly multicultural. And I got to London thinking that if I didn't like London, I'd give it a year and then I'd go to Dublin. But I arrived in London and honestly, it was like, I feel the same still, but it sounds very earnest and very young when I say this. I thought I had discovered the world. I mean, I'd come to another city, but everything that you could want to eat or try or immerse yourself in was there. I mean, I remember one of the first restaurants I went to was an Ethiopian place in someone's home, and we were all sitting on the floor and they were showing us how to use the bread and everything and how to use our hands. And my mind was completely blown. And I was very interested in food and I'd been cooking for a long time. But to have the other possibilities opened up was just unbelievable to me.
You were a TV producer. Tell us about the kind of stuff that you were doing in TV and whether that was introducing you to restaurant scene. You know, you do tend to take people out. Were you doing all that kind of schmoozing?
Yeah, because the first job I had was as a researcher on The Wogan Show. So, yes, I did I look back on that and think, my God, I was in Sally Clark's kind of like twice a week. But we had to take people out to decent restaurants to interview them. And that happened a lot. So I got more exposed to restaurants and restaurants that I couldn't actually afford to go to under normal circumstances. But within that, in my kind of, after I worked on a chat show, then I moved across and I did what at the time was kind of just, docs basically and magazine programs. And I worked on very different things. And mostly I didn't work on stuff to do with food. That was much later when I worked with Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall for quite a lot of his series. So it played a part in my television career, I suppose, but predominantly not. It was still a kind of passion that I kept for the rest of my life.
But you knew that it was there, because I had an expense account. I was selling advertising when I was 22 years old for Creative Review in 1985. So I was kind of in the middle of nouvelle cuisine and somebody was paying me to go and take photographers and film directors out for lunch. It was fantastic. And once you have tasted that kind of food, you can't untaste it. You know it's there. You know there's a scene in London, and that's the point, isn't it?
Oh, yes. I mean, it wasn't the only trend, but that was that was predominantly it. And I had my hexagonal plates and I reduced tons of veal stock and stuff like that in my flat. I mean, yeah, I was slightly afraid to tell people like this sometimes because I was quite addicted in a way. I mean, it was massive in my life. As well as nouvelle cuisine, I was kind of, the things I was predominantly cooking were Middle Eastern. I just kind of I went all out for that because it was when I was in that first flat that I discovered Claudia Roden's work. I didn't know who she was until then. And there was a Turkish green-fronted shop at the end of my road. And they, as well as having all the usual stuff, tea bags and loo rolls and bleach and whatever, they sold barberries and different flavours of olives. And I mean, I actually didn't know the word tahini. Can you believe that? At that stage, they called it sesame paste. But yeah, so I bought my tahini, and I had never tasted hummus. Can you imagine that either? So it was a very, very, very different world than the one we're in now. But I think in a way, it was very exciting because I had to pursue things. I had to track things down. I had to find them. I mean, if you had your travel card, I could go away for the entire day, going to different places looking for specific ingredients. I used to go to Ridley Road to get different kinds of peppers, long Turkish peppers. And of course, the Edgware Road was there that had everything. So I was able to go there and be, at that time anyway, more or less just kind of like surrounded by this kind of atmosphere and this sort of culture. Oh, and I started to go to, I tell you this as a by story because it's come into my head. I started going to Iranian restaurants. There was one quite near the BBC. It was in a porta cabin in a car park on Kensington High Street. It's called Alunak, and somebody told me about it. And the first night I went there, there were no people like me. Everybody was Iranian, and the menu was in Farsi. They had to kind of like tell me what was what, and it was so long I couldn't take it all in. So I just pointed at things, and I loved the bread, and I loved especially, there's a recipe for it in Crazy Water, the sabzi, the kind of mixture of vegetables and bread and herbs, loads of herbs for you to pick at the beginning. And the first time I had that, I didn't really kind of know what that was, but it seemed like the sort of cleanest and most appetite opening way to start a meal. And there was another Iranian restaurant that was near the BBC, and I went there and they helped me learn how to make Arab flatbread. I mean, I just went in the middle of the day at lunchtime once. So I was always, this wasn't my job, but this is what I was pursuing always.
Yeah. And that was actually your first food moment. It reminded me very much of when I was at GLR in 1990, when it first started, and in Marylebone, and opposite there was a place called Caravanserai.
Oh my God, I remember that.
Incredibly exotic. And it was that same thing where you had lots of things between courses, lots of little bitter herbs, for example. And it was all about kind of getting you to salivate, opening up the palate. It was a mind-blowing experience. I'm very interested in what was going on in your head at that time. And you and I have talked before on this podcast about you being a bookworm, about living in your head, and, when you were a child in Northern Ireland, that wonderful story you told us last time about, your teacher saying, put your head in your hands and put your head down, and she would read you stories and Little House on the Prairie, and you'd go off into your head. And I love the idea that you were reading Claudia Roden for the first time and going off to these Mediterranean lands and absorbing, smelling in your head, because you do have a very, very vivid imagination, don't you? When you were reading Claudia, were you then thinking, still a TV producer, I want to write? What was the leap for you from reading Claudia Roden, sniffing up all these smells, going into the grocers, living this life, and coming up with your very first book?
I didn't intend to do that at all. I think the work for Crazy Water, if you want to call it that, had been going on for years, but I wasn't aware of it. And I didn't start to write then until my eldest child was born, and he's 26 now. So when I go back, it's like another lifetime, basically. But I stayed in television, and then, I was making a series for Channel 4 about the cultural history of gardening in the UK. And I thought that was a good kind of series to go back to after you'd been off on maternity leave, because it wasn't a depressing subject. It would be, good fun, and it wouldn't be too hard. But actually, I was never home any day before 9:30. And I honestly thought I'd have a nervous breakdown if I couldn't see my child. He was 8 months, and, he had someone to look after him, and I didn't work every day. I had 1 day a week off, but I was shattered, which was to do, I think, still with I was still not sleeping properly because he was waking every night. So there was that. And then I'd gone to see someone outside London to talk to her about one of the new towns and the garden that she built with her husband in this new town. She was lovely. She was a very good interview. She was a lovely woman. She was saying interesting things. And I realised, I mean, with horror in a way, actually, that I didn't want to hear her. I couldn't have cared less. And that had never been like that for me. I was always dedicated. I loved kind of like the connection that you make with people that you're going to, interview in a documentary eventually. But I went in I was supposed also to go to Norfolk that weekend, just for a very long day, take Ted with me. And we had to do a recce of a garden up there. And I thought, I just can't do this. I can't. And I went in on the Monday morning. I'd only been there for 4 weeks. I went in on the Monday morning and I just said, look, I can't do this job anymore. And that was a kind of a bit of a shock, because it was like, what else are you going to do? That was the first thing. And then there was kind of, obviously, what can I do for money? But I was married at that time and I thought, oh, we'll get through this period until I feel okay about going back. But that was it, really. And so I went in and I resigned on the Monday, and I was incredibly lucky. On the Friday, Heather Holden-Brown, who was at Hodder at that time, she had commissioned a book from Anthony Carluccio, which he hadn't delivered. And she said, would I write it? I didn't do the recipes. I mean, he was doing that with someone else in the restaurant. But I had a meeting with him every week, and we talked about food. And I thought, my God, this is a job. I can read all this time about Italian vegetables, so I have all the background. And then I go and talk to him, he was very funny. And if you think you've met people who are obsessed with food, he was in a league of his own. And that was where it started, really. I didn't know where it would go, but it meant that actually it wasn't my own book, but I could write a book. I could go the length and write it very well. And I loved doing it. By this time, Ted was at home, but I got childcare, and the woman that came in to the house every day brought her own child as well. So there was lots of noise going on. It was hard to adjust to kind of hearing him cry, but going back to work, that was, God, that pulled on your heartstrings. I think it's a really tough time for many women, but that was it. I started to write, and then eventually people got to know about that. And I just had this, I eventually had this kind of career. Although it's funny, because the whole thing of writing pieces, not just doing books, it was Leonie Heighton, who at that time was in House and Garden. I got in touch with her. I took a whole day off once, and Ted went off with my husband at the time, and I thought, I'm going to write this piece. And I didn't really even know what to do, but I wrote this piece about pears, and I also put 6 recipes in there that had all been tested. And I sent it to Leonie Heighton at House and Garden, only because my mum had that when I was growing up, and I pulled out the kind of like the food sections. So I wrote to her, and she said to me later, well, I didn't have a clue who you were, but I really like the recipes and I like the writing. And I thought, well, I'll just try it. So while the kind of like working on other people's book was going on, I'd started to write pieces, which I knew was terrible now. And I think I was just, I don't know, I just hit the kind of like stars aligned, and I was just able to start working on books, and then actually to do pieces as well, because then I wrote for Food and Travel, and the amount of places I wrote for increased. But it was later when I got my work at the Telegraph.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because those pieces, as they're called, are great training for writing something that's more of a thesis, more of a whole book, because you have to really drill down into one subject, one ingredient or one dish, and really think about it. And of course, you've got to write beautifully in order to engage the reader. It's much more of a writing exercise, isn't it? It trains you incredibly well.
Do you know what? I had no long-term plans, and I didn't really think about it. I just did this thing that I was enjoying. And, writing had been a huge part of my job anyway, because I'd had to write scripts and things like that, or write research notes for different programs. So it wasn't hard, and it wasn't hard to dig down into the subject, because these were all things that I was very interested in. Different dishes from different parts of Italy, different vegetables. I mean, I could have spent a day doing that anyway, and it wasn't my job. So now I was doing this thing that actually I got paid for.
Yeah. And you're such a fan of literature as well. And, through the whole of Crazy Water, you're littering these wonderful sort of, poetry and beautiful prose from people like Fatima Manisi's Dreams of Trespass. And, you've even got Herodotus in there. And you love literature. You can tell that you just devoured the whole subject through literature.
I like finding bits of literature as well that did lead me into another world that was to do with food. I mean, Crazy Water, Pickled Lemons, it was partly called that because of Nigella Mahfouz's book. He's an Egyptian writer, and I read this. I actually read a little bit about what they had for breakfast in a review of the book in The Guardian, and I thought, they were having full mesdames, they were having preserved lemons, they were having eggs, and, different kinds of spice blends and stuff like that, and vegetables, and I thought, this sounds great. So I bought the book, which of course was also about much more than food. But I really like that way, and I've always liked the way that food takes you into a culture. I mean, I've travelled a lot, but I'm quite an anxious traveller, and quite often the way I kind of found that I could feel at ease in somewhere that was very different was through the food. I mean, I wouldn't hesitate to go into hotel kitchens or kitchens in a restaurant to see what they were up to, because it made a connection. And I think I suffer from depression from time to time, and I think if you're like that, I think connection is very important. I mean, that's why I could never actually live in the countryside. I love visiting it, but I have to be in a place where I can go around the corner and chat to the newsagent. I think life is really made up of those small things.
Yeah, we were talking to Rachel Roddy last week on the Cooking the Books live down in Hove, and we were talking about how she made her home in Rome when she didn't have anything apart from her phone and a toothbrush. Really, she hadn't met her would-be husband by that time. She didn't know anyone. She didn't have a single friend in Rome, so she connected to Rome through its food, and suddenly she wasn't lonely anymore.
Because when you ask people about their food, they want to tell you. I mean, there are other things you might ask them. They're kind of like politics or whatever, not very keen to talk to you at all. But everybody loves their food, and they love their mother's food, and they love their family food. And you easily make a connection.
Let's go into how you managed to get Crazy Water published. You didn't write a proposal. You pitched it. Tell me what happened.
Well, someone from Mitchell Beasley Publishing, which is part of Octopus, I think it was then as well, got in touch with me, and I honestly wasn't sure why she wanted to meet. So I met her, and I thought during the conversation that she probably wanted to see if I could ghostwrite more books, since I'd done college shows, that I might be able to work with chefs. And lots of people did that. And indeed, I did do that for quite a long number of years, even when I was writing my own stuff. But at the end of the meeting, and meeting is kind of like a grand term for it, I'm not sure what it was, I said, I have a book in my head. And she said, oh, what? And I said, oh, it's this thing called, I said, the best thing about it is the title. And it's called Crazy Water, Pickled Lemons. And basically, it's about the kind of ingredients I dreamt about when I was growing up in Northern Ireland, which is very grey, not remotely exotic. It's about the dishes that I find that come from the Mediterranean and North Africa and the Middle East that seem quite magical to me in some way. They can either be magical because you don't know how they work. So I was thinking of, Claudia Roden's boiled orange cake. I mean, you put that in the tin and you look at it and you think that will never be a cake. So there's that. And then there were other things about places that I'd been, like Catalonia, because it has quince alioli. So it's Spanish garlic mayonnaise, basically, but they also make them with fruit. And I just thought these things are all extraordinary. And there were different areas of the world, but they all came roughly from that kind of region. And I had travelled in most of them, but not all of them. I mean, I hadn't been to Iran, and I didn't stop to think, funny enough, it might be different now, that I shouldn't do this because this wasn't my food. It was basically the food of my imagination and the food I had longed for as I was growing up. So in a way, I didn't think pomegranates were any more someone else's as they were mine, because they, pomegranates, they just seemed as unusual as unicorns to me, things that I dreamt about finding. And then when I came to London, of course, I did find them. But anyway, they liked the idea, and she seemed to more or less buy it on the spot, but I can never remember a phrase that was used. She just said, "Oh, I love this. I think this could be really good." And I went. I mean, I didn't have a mobile phone. See how anti-tech I am. Oh my God! Even when everyone else had mobile phones, I didn't. So I went and found a phone box and phoned my mum, and I said, "I think I've had a book commissioned." Anyway, I raced home, and then I did all of these. If you were doing a television program, if you were pitching that, it was called a treatment. So I wrote about what would be in it, how it would be structured. I even did photocopies of kind of like fonts I thought would be good. I did photocopied pictures of what I would like it to feel like. So it was very much about trying to gather a feeling together and write about it, but also kind of create it visually.
So a mood board.
A mood board, more or less, yeah. But I did more than I needed to do. I mean, nobody was going to let me choose my own fonts and everything. But I did that thing, and it was like, even to me, it felt like, oh, this book is alive already. It exists. When the publisher took it to their kind of like sales meeting there, they all loved it too. So I think the book had formed, and it had formed over the years in a way.
I'm just thinking back to that time. On television, we'd had Nigella and Nigel Slater, really at that cusp of sort of 1999, 2000. We'd had, Delia, obviously, who'd been teaching us to cook. And so there was some interest. We'd had Mardo Jaffrey and Rick Stein and people like that earlier. So we had more sort of documentaries about food, but there was a great sort of a beginning of an interest. And the supermarkets were beginning to get more interesting ingredients in there, as Delia and Jamie Oliver, who was still doing, just early Naked Chef at this time. There were some interesting ideas about food. We were getting into it, but it was all in our imagination. So if you're pitching an exotic book that is all about beautiful descriptions. I love the way that you write about saffron. You write those blood red threads that turn whole platters of food into gold, bleeding yolk yellow streaks over creamy chicken and milky white yogurt. Yes! Any editor, any publisher is going to go, gimme that, because we're still living in our imaginations. The cooking didn't really happen for a while.
Quite a long time, actually, because it's very funny, because with the book coming out, people got in touch with me, and somebody said this week just on an email to me, I didn't know what Zug was. I'd never had labneh. And I really loved these things, but I'd kind of taught myself out of books and going to eat in different places. But, I had to go to find pomegranate molasses. And that seems ridiculous now, because the kind of, partly down to Yotam, of course, Ottolenghi, but the influence of those and the availability of those things went quite fast once it started. I mean, I can remember telling Waitrose, I've worked for Waitrose for years in various ways, that they really ought to have pomegranate molasses, and they absolutely needed to get preserved lemons. And of course, people have, people who are into that kind of thing, then I have preserved lemons in their fridge. It's not a big deal. But it was nobody had really thought about it. And nobody said to me, though, you shouldn't do this bit because we can't get those ingredients. Because part of the thing was that you had to make an effort to do that.
But it wasn't just new ingredients. It was about revisiting what we'd probably already plucked off a tree in Portugal. Olives. You write about olives. You say they tasted salty and sweet, buttery and inky. They still make me shudder. They taste so aggressively of themselves. I mean, with a fig, the amount of times I've taken a fig off a tree in Portugal and, it's still warm. You write that. You say, if the fig is young and untouched, the quince is all woman, curvaceous but graceful, mature, comfortable with herself and resilient to knocks. A big honey-sweet mama of a fruit. You're going to buy a quince, aren't you? It's sexy stuff. It's about thinking again about what you know, as well as putting the labneh and the pomegranate molasses in the pantry. It's about really waking up to food. And that was the beginning of our real interest in starting to put all of these pieces of the jigsaw together. Ottolenghi, Claudia Roden, Diana Henry, plus what we know and what we're finding in the supermarkets. And suddenly we become much, much, much more interesting cooks in this country.
Yeah. And olives is a funny thing, actually, because we'd had them at home, and I'd never. I mean, my mum used to get them if they were having parties, like, you know, stuffed ones. I don't know if anybody ate them ever, but I didn't like them. And then we went. I mean, I was quite old, and we went. I think it was just after my A levels actually, and we hadn't travelled much as a family, but we went to Greece that summer, and I really liked the black ones, and then eventually I liked the green ones as well. But it was also about the trees themselves. If you looked at them, I mean, I've just been thinking about Provence lately because I wondered if we should go there in the summer rather than go to Italy. Because I went there every year for quite a long time before I had children, and the way that light catches all the trees, and you don't really know whether they're silver grey or whether they're green because they flicker. And I'd read Van Gogh's letters about staying in Saint-Remy. That was a bad time for him. I mean, that's when he cut off his ear, so he wasn't happy. But he still noticed this stuff. And in fact, he seemed, in a way, I felt in a way that you had to see things that intensely to make things that were interesting out of what you saw. I mean, I was never doing it on that kind of level, but I could see when a place got under your skin, and also the food of a place, you know, figs and olives are quite evocative. So I could see how that would happen, and that was happening to me, I think, really, bit by bit.
Wonderful. I mean, I wish I could remember the quote of Van Gogh, because he does actually say that, doesn't he? He says something like, to really understand joy, you have to kind of go through the pain to get to the intensity of it, or something like that. Let's stick with Provence, though. You mentioned Provence, and it's one of your food moments. Your second food moment is the quail's eggs with radishes and the tapenade. And it's interesting, you did sort of mention it before, this cultural appropriation is a thing now, but it wasn't at that time. And you write, you know, the Provençals even argue about how to make this tapenade, but you kind of do it anyway because it tastes nice. How does that feel now? Do you still kind of feel that way, that you can just do what you like, really?
Yes and no. I think I worry a bit too much, actually, about being purist. I kind of like, I mean, this is going to change. I worry that at one stage it will get to a place where nothing is as it once was. Nothing is traditional. Everything is kind of like has crossed over. But I still like to eat dishes that are from a particular place. I mean, it's okay to change things slightly to kind of mesh two recipes together that are for a similar thing, like with that tapenade. There are lots of recipes for tapenade, and most of them just use olives, but there's also some who use anchovies and tuna as well. Do I still do it? I love that. That's probably cooked more often during the summer than any other dish, because you whisk it all in a food processor, and then you've got to get good radishes, and quail eggs are not difficult to get now, and the quail eggs look beautiful because you take some of the shells off so you can see the blueness of the inside of the shells. And I think that I love the pepperiness of radishes and the real kind of crispness as well. So they're just wonderful to dip in. And also, even if you haven't got people coming around, a bowl of that in the fridge of that type, oh God, it's gorgeous. And it's healthy and it's easy to make, and you do it. But ultimately I use my own taste buds when I put things together, which is why I've never really worked with a tester, because I can't completely understand how that works. So I'm standing there with my spoon set, and I'm adding another half teaspoon and more of something else. And that's how I work my recipes out. But so they sort of are mine to some extent because I make them mine. But at the same time, they're quite often traditional dishes. I mean, I make stuff up as well. That's kind of, my kind of like stock in trade is what you do with a packet of chicken thighs on a Wednesday night, because I've had to do years of cooking like that. So you come up with stuff, but I still like as well to see dishes that are from somewhere. I mean, sometimes I look at a new yotam recipe, and I partly think, how has he done that? And then I also partly think, what will that taste like? I try to kind of like eat it in my head to see what part all of those ingredients will have played. But I also sometimes think, why would you do that? Because creativity is part of cooking. But there's already so much to make. I mean, I don't have a long enough life still to cook the dishes that I love on a regular basis, but also to cook new ones, because I go to new places and I get new ideas.
What's the point? Because, I mean, so much of what you do is you take us around the world to places that you have been to. So, you know, your third food moment is eating in Catalonia, Catalan black rice. I want to know about that. That's something that takes me to a place. So, you know, what's the point of making new stuff up when there's so much to tell me about?
I slightly do think that, really, because if you see that recipe, you will also hear the kind of context of it. So you might want to try it. Although, of course, Catalonia is the place, ironically, which has been most inventive because of, you know, unusual cuisines, unusual kind of like invention in a scientific kind of way, molecular. But when I first went to Catalonia, I was really surprised at the drama of it. And this was just with eating their food. It wasn't eating anything kind of that was modernized or anything. And I had that black rice one. I can remember the restaurant and never heard of it before. And it's made with squid ink. It's not like risotto because it's made with paella rice and you mustn't stir that. So it's sort of the opposite. You just you let the stock reduce as it's cooking. And it's black. I mean, it stains your teeth when you eat it because it's black with squid ink. And you can either put squid in it as well, or you can, I think there's scallops with that particular dish because I really liked the sweetness of the scallops against the saltiness of the black rice. And then you have, alioli as well. So it's got, these are huge flavors. And I think I was just shocked because I could never have thought of it, all of those things in one dish. It was just beyond what I could have imagined. And I thought I was quite good at imagining things. But still, in Catalonia, it was like, what? You know, and there was sort of dish after dish of that stuff that was very far away from what I'd eaten before.
Yeah, it's about blowing your mind, isn't it? It is about mind bombs. Your fourth food moment is, I think, it's the most important mind bomb for me. If crazy water of the title is actually just poached fish and isn't terribly exciting, perhaps for the chili, but it's a great name. The pickled lemons, the preserved lemons are actually, I think, one of the most beautiful contributions to modern British cooking. Is that why you chose them for your fourth food moment?
Preserved lemons, I find it difficult to explain what they taste like. I don't think they taste like anything else. They're far away from what we think of as a lemon flavour because there isn't freshness. And of course, their skin is soft and it's not zingy. But I had them, well, the first ones I made myself. So I was trying to do those, and we don't have the right kind of lemons actually in Britain. In Morocco, they have very small, thin-skinned ones, and they use those. But I didn't taste those till I went to Morocco. But if you just do a lemon that you can get here and you salt it and you taste it as it's developing. And then the first dish I used it in was it's not a traditional dish. I just put the ingredients together. It's chicken with sweet onions and preserved lemons. I think I love the salty sweet thing. I think that's one of my things. It's the same reason for why I like quite a lot of Southeast Asian stuff like Vietnamese, Thai, hot sour, salty sweet, all that. And in Moroccan food, it's also like that too. It's quite sweet things and then some of the time, and then you have the preserved lemons with their saltiness and their depth. I mean, I use what preserved lemons are kind of like end up being pickled in. I use the brine to add to other things, sometimes to add to a dressing. I mean, I just added it recently to a dressing that was made of preserved lemons and honey. And I used some of the brine, for the rest of the vinaigrette. And that just works brilliantly. It's just one of those ingredients you can take and think, what can I do with this? Because it's... I could never have thought of how to do those by myself. I had to read about those and then I had to go and taste them in Morocco to see what they were like. But I think at the same time, and this sounds completely opposite to what I'm saying about not, crossing different cuisines over. I think the thing is, well, then suddenly people started using preserved lemons in gremolata and putting it on kind of like Italian dishes, putting it on an ossobuco. And I think gremolata is a good idea because that's just basically a thing that will heighten flavours and it will add bursts of flavour at the end of cooking in any kind of cuisine you care to think about in a way. So it is kind of about adopting and adapting, I think, and everything can be kind of like, it can be all up in the air because every person is there, is a creator in themselves, and it doesn't matter what you do. I just don't like doing cooking dishes that have too many strands of flavour in them. I have a bit of an issue with that. And, oh my God, and sometimes I get fed up with particular flavours that become dominant because you see them everywhere. Please, miso, just give it a rest for a while. They just come, and you cannot, even once you put miso in a thing, there's no disguising it. That is it. But, your banana cake with miso, your kind of roast chicken with onions and miso, it's one flavour. I mean, you're adding other things to it. But I think, and I feel responsible for this kind of thing, this kind of obsession that we get with particular flavours, and then we won't let them go. And then the other thing is it's about fashion. It's kind of, so miso's in, so that means eventually miso must be out. No, nothing is in and nothing is out. Do whatever you like. These tastes, they're in, and products and foods, they're in different kind of cultures. So I think it's kind of like not intelligent to say that they're out once you've had enough of them. But at the same time, I kind of think, miso can have a little rest now for a while.
22 years after Crazy Water Pickled Lemons was first published, I mean, you are now almost able to be called a grande dame.
I'm not sure about the grande dame thing because that makes me sound very old, Dilly. I mean, I think that Claudia Roden is a grande dame, and she's very old now, not that you would kind of think it. I think just mentioning her, I think one of the wonderful things that has happened in my life and which makes me feel as if, oh my God, I just entered this incredible territory, though for me it's not about being known, is that I now know Claudia and I go and have dinner with her. And my person, it still makes, look, I've just shivered as I said that because I'm going to see her soon. This person who had such an impact on me as a writer and as a cook and as a kind of like a person being able to travel in my head, she did that, and that's to do with my entire life. That's not just to do with that one book. And I think that I've got to the stage where, I'm 60 and I can go and have a whiskey with Claudia of an evening and kind of like stand with her at her kind of like the back door of her kitchen looking out at the fairy lights in her neighbour's garden. How lucky am I?
Thanks for listening. Head over to my Substack for extra bites from Diana, and I'll see you next week.